You have to make peace with the kind of writer you are, and I don't think we have a lot of choice over that sometimes.
Welcome to Creative Insanity. Creative Insanity.
What's going on, people? Today is part 2 of my conversation with J.H. Moncrieff. Today we dive right into my story, my answer for the prompt Rage and Freedom that J.H. wrote to last week. J.H. dissects my story and gives me some really encouraging feedback. Then we dive into some real meat. We talk about having a sense of failure throughout accomplishment, feeling like a failure even though you're accomplishing tremendous things. How common is that for a creative person, and how do you deal with that? And besides some really good advice that JH gives for aspiring authors, we really examine the Canadian literary scene from the perspective of a genre writer. We really get into the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I think that it's invaluable information, especially if you're an aspiring author in Canada, but it's applicable everywhere. If you're an aspiring author and you want to write and be known for your work, listen to this episode. You're going to get so much out of JH's experience as I did. It's going to be lots of good fuel for you and maybe even a little entertaining. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to continue the story time, or whatever it is I'm going to call these things, with my story. We spent a lot of time with JH's story, dissecting it. I really wanted to pull some really interesting lessons for writers out of it. I feel good about that episode. You feel good about it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh, that's super confident.
Yeah.
Way better. Way better. So now, just to remind everybody, the prompt is Rage and Freedom. And I'm going to read my story now, and then we're going to talk about that a bit, and then we're going to get into some other stuff, I'm sure, as time permits. So, she doesn't have that thing anymore. That stubbornness it requires to push a man away when he tries to kiss you. Instead, Annika has a special prayer she says in her mind, a kind of rote mantra that washes her of all culpability. It will all be over soon. The mantra attacks her from within, while the elements attack from without, her hair is soaking through the back of her dress down to her lower back, maybe even her underwear. Not from rain. His hand is holding her wrist below his jacket line, precariously in the minor space between them, and gently enough. This looks like he's exerting some control over the situation, she imagines, but it must be nothing more than the force of habit, not enough air between them to billow. When the man finally pulls his lips away from hers, she witnesses heat escape his mouth. His breath is like smoke from a dragon. She imagines slaying him. Curiosity plays puppetry with his eyebrows as he appears to consider her alongside a few dark thoughts. Everything is cold, but she doesn't feel much. There's no point running, she thinks, despite the urge. They're both locked in now. This is a dance, a kind of predestination that will happen without either of their consent. And no matter how bad she wants this to end differently, she knows intrinsically in her bones how it's going to go. There is no resisting fate. She thinks he said his name was Timothy. It was loud in the bar. She might have misheard him. Is this where you invite me in? Annika says in her native tongue. And honestly, it does take some effort to pull off that unnatural schoolgirl inflection. That's the kind of thing that works. Timothy has a clean-shaven face. He has short, dark American hair that ends in neatly kept sideburns, and a few white hairs in his eyebrows. He seems a bit older than the usual. As she thinks this, a furious insect thrashes in her stomach with the thought of holding his passport, reading every physical detail and checking for accuracy. Is he really 198 centimeters tall? Are his eyes really hazel, or some shade in between? Is his name really Timothy even? And how does he spell it? She has a thing for names. Would you like me to invite you in? He responds finally, perhaps timidly, but that could be the language barrier. Annika is puzzled regardless. This is answering a question with a question, and it feels out of place. If it wasn't for the sudden squint of his eyes and a singular raised cheek, something she's learned long ago to identify as a textbook smirk, she would be forced to wonder if he had hesitation with that question. Maybe he doesn't want to follow through. Maybe he doesn't want to sleep with her. Annika mirrors his facial expression carefully. She's trying to embody something called playfulness when she says in her best English, "I don't think we have a choice." She can tell he's ogling her lips again, unconcerned with the protest she'd like to display behind her eyes, but probably isn't. Low affect, unfortunately, since she was a kid. Annika wants to tell him no in this moment. She wants to say he needs to turn around and leave. She wants all the courage in the world, but she is a coward, ultimately. She knows the rules. She knows what happens next. He will kiss her again. She'll nearly bite his lip bloody. Then he will continue to hold her in some fashion, whether by the hand or the wrist, and he will lead her up to their fate. She'll wear her purse off her shoulder until she decides to freshen up with it. On the way up, a little small talk occurs, but nothing to write home about. She is slow in her English, and he can barely pass with his Russian. Timothy almost has the appearance of nervousness, is her read. He maintains a progressive decrease in eye contact with her, double-checking buttons in the elevator with sweeping glances as they wait, clinging to each other awkwardly like new lovers might. Is it possible that Timothy isn't a one-night stand kind of guy? Annika wonders. This wouldn't make sense exactly, she thinks. He is relatively young, attractive, and single in what is to him a foreign country with many attractive women. She tries to study his actions and run it against the other encounters she's had like this. Most American men don't have an apartment, obviously, and these nights end in hotels, with mornings of regret more than anything, and her hiding all evidence of an encounter. But Timothy is here on government work, and his stride up until this elevator has so far been confident enough, almost aloof. Tonight could be different. The Americans have provided him with a place for 6 months, apparently. That much was ascertained from their conversation at the bar, before he kissed her. "I have a towel," he says in persistent Russian, breaking the silence, and he motions to her hair. She can see the pool of liquid forming in fragments next to her feet. The door opens onto the 7th floor, and she unconsciously scans for security cameras. She instinctively wants no proof that this ever happened. The feeling of rage toward herself is one of the only feelings she ever feels. And that feeling starts to come early. Before his clothes are off even, she feels rage, and perhaps a little shame. What does that say about her self-worth? Why can't she walk away from him? Bury it, bury it. At the mouth of his apartment, Timothy stops and searches her eyes. Men have done this to her before. She gets the feeling that they're looking for lights in an empty house. "Are you sure you want to come in?" he asks. He has one hand on either of her wet shoulders. This would be her chance. Annika searches her soul, or something like that. She does this mental routine you're supposed to do before engaging in regretful behavior. Then she adjusts her purse strap and reaches to touch his stomach, slides her hand under his hanging shirt, and slips her fingers into his underwear. Annika feels him. Timothy tolerates this, still searching her eyes, and she allows him to. "You won't find anything," she'd like to say. Then she reaches with her other hand to his jawline and pulls him in, kissing him and touching him passionately. Predictably, this is what it takes to convince him. Her hand retreats to guard her purse, and he lets her into his apartment where, un-American-like, he removes his shoes in a hurry and finds her a white towel from the hallway closet. She shuts the door behind her, and it leaves them in near darkness. She locks it out of habit and takes the towel under her arm. "I want you naked and on the bed," she says to him in perfect English. "No questions." Timothy hesitates for a moment, but like all men, he starts to obey her, taking off his jacket and stepping toward what must be the master bedroom, not bothering with the lights. There is a dark blue hue from the sky that peeks in through his kitchen windows at the end of the hall, a blinking red 12 o'clock on the microwave in need of an updated time setting. There's also a note of sunset orange from downtown, hovering out there like clouds below midnight. "I'd like to freshen up," she says. That's an expression she got from American movies, and it has never failed to work. Of course, he shows her to the washroom, kisses her once more, then walks away as she carefully closes a sliding door between them. The light flickers twice as she turns it on, her face a visage no different than it always is in the mirror. Men see this as beautiful. A woman who rarely smiles is said not to develop wrinkles. She hears him add suddenly, and again in butchered Russian, "I'm not sorry for spilling my drink on you after all." There is undeniable excitement in his voice, words likely spoken through a large smile. It appears that Timothy has resigned himself to the affair now. Good for Timothy. After drying her hair, Annika rinses her face and opens her purse to feel through it. She pulls out a stick of lip balm and rubs it against her lips, not bothering to pucker. She returns it to the deep end of the bag and next pulls out a stack of what is now 12 passports. She thumbs through them carefully, the furious insect returning to that pit in her stomach. This is a dance, you know. This is her 7th American man, she realizes. Otherwise, she's had only 2 Canadians, a Frenchman, a Norwegian, and the 2 gentlemen from Japan. The names on the passports are Gregory, Ian, Sebastian, Norman, Brandon, Rolf, Shunta, Tatsu, David, Jerome, Byron, and Mathis. She has a thing for names. The last thing she pulls from her purse is a slim but hardy knife, the blade no longer than 4 inches. This is easy enough to hide in her palm, she knows, as long as the blade is pointed towards her wrist. It might be getting a bit dull at this point, unfortunately, but that's life. One day she'll get around to resharpening it. Either way, she thinks, it will all be over soon. Ta-da!
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Thanks. What'd you think?
Well, first of all, I thought that was the title because that's how you sent me. It will all be over soon, and I thought that was a great title.
Is it a good title? I thought maybe too on the nose. I don't know.
No, I loved it because you have no idea where it's going in the beginning.
Right. So, did it surprise you at all? Like, did you think it was going to go that way, or?
Well, first of all, it really, and I don't mean this in any bad way at all, but it really surprised me that you wrote that because it struck me as, not that you're not literary, but struck me, especially, I think with people not seeing the words on the page, they may miss parts of it, but it's a very literary story. You do a lot of playing with language and a lot of imagery. And it's very poetic in a lot of ways.
Dang.
And I that's not what I expected to come from this. You know, not that it wouldn't, I don't equate literary writing with quality. So I'm not saying I didn't think you'd write quality, but the type of poetic, very lyrical writing, I didn't expect that from this rage and freedom story. So that was interesting.
Thanks.
I have so many questions.
Go on.
So is she a serial killer, or is this just a circumstance that she's found herself in because she needs to survive, or is she like just full on serial killer?
So my belief about her was that she is effectively a serial killer, but she's not a full psychopath or anything. Of course, being a psychopath doesn't equivocate to serial killer. There is some crossover that does happen in history, but yeah, she's very, what would you say? I think near sociopathic, and it happens to coincide with the fact that she is a serial killer. Yeah. But what's interesting to me was that she has this sense of shame, but it's the kind of predestination, right? It's like, seems like she just can't stop herself. So does that answer your first question?
Almost like, yeah, she's taking advantage of the situation, right? She just happens to be in this country where all these tourists are coming, all these different men for business, and she's figured out a way to make that work to her advantage, either because something happened to her that wasn't so nice.
Yeah, so I don't go into that. Like, there's definitely backstory to a character like her. There's like, why is she this way? What is it exactly that causes her to... Because the conflict that I was trying to create a bit was that it seems like what she's upset about is that she doesn't want to engage in sexual behavior with this guy, that she has some reservation, right? And she's, at every turn, every hesitation that he brings up, she still keeps pushing forward despite her own hesitation. But of course, she's not hesitant about that. She's hesitant about killing him. which
Or
is,
is she?
or is she? Yeah, I wonder. Like, I was really interested in her for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Does,
Hopefully not romantically.
yeah, that wouldn't end well. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. There was another thing you did too. It's not so much a question, but when you said not from rain,
Mm.
I spent the rest of that story going, why? Like, why was
Right.
her
Yeah.
hair?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
no, it was great because it's like it just you threw in that not from rain. It's like, why in the heck would her hair be wet? And I'm like trying to figure out all these reasons that, her hair would be wet. And it's like, oh, okay, that's set up this entire thing in
Yeah.
a way, right? Because if he hadn't spilt his drink on her, although it must have been a hell of a drink,
Yeah.
if he hadn't spilt his drink on her and soaked her,
Yeah.
he might not have been the victim for that night. Or
Yeah. So like it was interesting in that the whole why I kept that and why I had that I think was because the whole encounter, it made it more tragic in a way. Like it was less premeditated. It seemed like this was a thing that was just going to happen. A man was taking interest in her. He spilt his drink, obviously, and they had some parlay of speech. Like they talked a bit, and there was a language barrier, and he kissed her, and it seems to be maybe he was a bit presumptuous in that action, but then he kind of seems to walk it back, right? Like he's like, are you sure? Like, is this okay? Like he's not repentant of however it started, but he seems to really be trying to get her consent. And maybe he didn't have that at first, but I don't know. Like, yeah. So Garrett read this story too, actually, because we
okay,
actually made a little low key writers group behind the scene. We put the prompt to a couple other writer friends, and they've written stories as well, and they're super awesome. We won't get into them, but I have one other person who's given me feedback on it, and it was on this exact part. And he was like, I don't know what's going on, or why was she wet? Like he needed clarification at the end. And I was like, oh, it's because he spilled the drink. And it was just he either missed that or it didn't stand out to him. I missed lots of stuff in his stories. But when you brought it up, I was worried that you were going to say that you were confused about it. So I was like,
I was right until that point, and then I was kind of like, could a
and
drink do that? But when I looked, because I thought
yeah.
in my head she was soaked from the head up, but when I read it again, no, you didn't say that. You just said the back of her head was soaked. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, like
It's amazing though.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that could have been what image was in his mind too. Cause you say that, I don't know why I chose to say like not from rain. You know what it was is that I think I said something else and then I changed it to because I was like, wait a minute, it's like snowing. If anything, if it might be snowing because it's so cold and it's Russia, it's cold. They're outside the bar and everything is cold. But
I like that. I like that.
Cool. I'm glad it worked for you. I liked it too.
It puts a question in your head and you're waiting for that payoff. It's like, wait a minute, why was her hair wet? But there's so many great lines. Like you foreshadowed the passport, and I didn't even realize that until you read it aloud. Where you're like, she's imagining how his stats would read out in his passport. To me, that was so natural. I didn't even think that was foreshadowing anything, and I didn't even get that the first time I read it. But when you read aloud, I'm like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what does she do with them?
I think they're just her trophies. That's what I think is that she just keeps
okay.
them. Like she has a thing for names. So she's, whatever that means, she kind of likes names. And so that's why she misheard his name, but she wasn't eager to correct him, right? Like she wasn't like, was your name Timothy? I just want to be clear. She instead wanted to wait to get to see his passport. But yeah, I'm so glad that worked because like, yeah, I had a moment in there. The passport thing, actually, originally it was his wallet or something, like his license. But then when I realized, oh, he's a foreigner, he's from out of the country, the passport thing clicked for me and I changed it. So it was her having excitement about holding his passport and like checking his stats, and how when you, at the time, you think it's kind of like, oh, look, she must, she's curious about him. She does think he's attractive. Like there's part of her that's just intrigued about this man and she wants to know a little more. It's kind of like this innocent fly on the wall curiosity, but then you realize, no, that's Okay, so that's one. I have a good line I threw in there. I wanted to know if you caught.
Oh, I really liked fragments of water because we
Hmm.
don't think of water. Like at first that jarred me because we don't think of water being that way. But I really liked that, the fragments of water. I
Oh,
know there was a
thanks.
bit more to it than that.
Yeah, yeah. That I like that line too quite a bit because I'm just imagining how like water collects. It doesn't always. It's not just gonna be one pool, but it's kind of like in sections, and sometimes depending on the floor, it'll collide together. But yeah, thanks.
And I think my favorite was lights on in a house that where no one's home when he was like trying to look in her eyes. I really like that one.
Oh man, thanks. I really like that line too. That one just kind of came out. That was that was the muse. It just yeah. That's how I felt writing her. Was like the lights on or there's no lights on and but you're like looking in this empty house. Like that's kind of what I felt like. But I had some sympathy for her. Just not as much I think by the end as I started to have for poor Timothy. um, thanks. Yeah. I threw a line in there that it was a little bit different, but once I knew where the ending was, what it was going to be, I kind of adjusted it slightly. So it's literally, technically fourth paragraph, but they're really tiny paragraphs. And it's talking about the heat escaping from his mouth. It says his breath is like smoke from a dragon. She imagine,
Yes,
yeah, you caught that one?
yes. I
And
wrote that one, but it's in bad pen, so
oh,
you can't read it. So I missed it. But yes, I love that one.
says she imagines slaying him. And I was like, is that give it all away at first? And I was like, no, it's kind of like alluding to sexual behavior, honestly, like it or something. Like it's like this poetic thing. And then when you read the context, you realize she imagines slaying him means she imagines killing him, right? So it's like that's what I was thinking anyway. I was excited about
Oh,
that line.
I knew Timothy wasn't coming to a good end.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you would as a dark fiction writer. You saw that line, you were probably like, something's
No, she
happening.
means slaying. She means slaying. What I found so interesting about this is we both took characters that would historically be on top. So
Mm,
in my case, it was the Karens of the world.
right,
And in your case, it was the American businessman.
right.
And I teach Russian students, right? And I mean, there's so many ways Russian women are treated horribly and victimized. You know, the Russian mail order brides, and they're treated
Yeah,
horribly. And often the ones that I end up working with, they lack so much confidence and they're so hard on themselves about their English and that when they move here. So for you to write a story where that's flipped and it's the American who's struggling with his language and sounding like an idiot and it's her that has the power, I love that. I
oh,
really,
nice.
really love that she was, here's this Russian woman who we normally always see as, oh, the mail order bride
Hmm.
or the poor farm girl or the woman who needs to be saved from somebody with someone, right?
Yeah.
I love that you put her in a position of power.
Mm,
I thought it was really cool.
I'm fascinated. Yeah, I was fascinated by it. It was just it's funny how it came out, and it is interesting the similarities that we have in our stories. Like there's both in your case, someone dies by knife stabbing and strangulation, and I allude that someone's gonna die by knife stabbing. So like two women kill somebody with a knife, basically in both our stories, which is crazy cool. Rage and freedom, yet we both come to this murderous women thing, somehow. It's interesting how we thought similar, but then of course interesting how it diverges as well. Mine, I think, seems to be well. How would you classify my genre? Is this a genre piece? Is this a thriller? Or like, what is this?
I would say literary thriller, yeah.
Okay. I like
Or
that.
suspense because you don't get right into the thrills, right? You're building.
Hmm.
You're building. So if you had to be really picky, I'd say it's suspense.
I like that. Good to know if I ever try to get it published anywhere.
Oh, it's great. You should.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm thrilled that it turned out. And so let's talk about pantsing for a minute, because that's my process as well. So last week, but just earlier, we talked a bit about how you are a pantser and how you just like go through it and it happens. And it's such this crazy cool thing. For me, I had this whole other story because we had Rage and Freedom. I talked to Garrett a little bit about it, or I kind of shared my idea. And it was just really cryptic, like he was going to read it. So it was that I had this idea of a criminal or a convict, somebody who had been convicted of murder or something very severe. They were going to be writing a letter to the victim's mother. That was going to be my story, where it was going to be this letter. It was going to be telling of this story that it was going to be a crime of passion that occurred, and he was going to be apologetic. And then I thought maybe the mother would write back or something, and there'd be a twist somewhere. I didn't know where, but it was like, that's Rage and that's freedom. He's locked down in prison, so that's my idea. And when I sat down to write that, I was so bored with that idea because I had to think of it. I just started writing, she doesn't have that thing anymore, that stubbornness it requires to push a man away when he tries to kiss you. And I don't know where it came from, but it was like, okay, so this is happening. And I didn't know it was, I think, the line, everything is cold, but she doesn't feel much. That's when I realized that she was a character who was, I was going to say emotionally challenged, where she didn't, I allude to the fact that she has to read his emotions. She has to pay attention to his, what a textbook smirk is literally a textbook smirk. She has to describe it in her mind. He's done this. So then she tries to mirror him, that psychopathy, sociopathy, lack of empathy stuff going on, right? So I tried to pick that up, and I realized when she was there, I knew where the story was going. And then I was able to step away and think for a minute and be like, oh man, what if that's what's happening here? Is like, she's nervous. She's not upset about this. She's upset about that. Can I do it? Can I pull it off? And so then I had a goal, but because it's so short, I still able to maintain the thread. So it seems like maybe I knew more of where mine was going at a certain point than you did. Does that mean I'm an outliner, or is it like a part pants, part outline, or?
No, because you didn't have an outline, did you?
No outline. I just thought about it after I got to a certain point.
Like I knew Karen was going to croak.
Yeah.
I knew that before I even started writing. I knew that. I wanted to have some fun with that. What we all wish we could do sometimes when we're on social media and you're arguing with that person who just doesn't get it. You would never actually kill them. But if something else could do it for you, or something for you, I just wanted to play with that a bit. So I knew that there was no way. She tried. She was starting to work that, I've had heartache too, and I was like, shut up, Karen. I don't want to know. We're not going to make you human right now.
Yeah.
Which I ordinarily wouldn't do. If I had longer, if I didn't have to read it aloud in a podcast without boring the crap out of people, I probably would have gone for about 5,000 words, and I would have made it a little grayer.
Yeah.
But I definitely knew Karen wasn't gonna come to a good. There was just no way.
Not with that haircut.
No, definitely not. But the line that you opened with, can you read that again? Like the very first line?
She doesn't have that thing anymore. That stubbornness it requires to push a man away when he tries to kiss you.
But wasn't it just, she doesn't have that thing anymore? And then
comma. So it's comma. Yeah.
Yeah, just that she doesn't have that thing anymore. I really like that. I really, really like that. So you're already going, what thing? Oh, who is this? Yeah, there was just some really good phrasing in that story.
Well, this is very high praise. I feel very almost flustered. Like, I'm excited. Like, I'm thrilled that you picked up what I was laying down. Do you have any good, not negative, but critical feedback? Do you feel like this could have been expanded? Was there something that I could have pulled off a little better, or is it not require nitpicking, or does something need to be picked up? I'm open.
There was only one thing, but it is fairly nitpicky. And when I went, it made me go back and look to see if I'd missed something. So it's very minor. It can be fixed very easily, but I was just a little bit confused over whether this was an apartment or a hotel. Because when they start going up
Oh,
to the seventh floor, I immediately thought they were in a hotel, but then it starts talking about apartments. So I'm like, wait a minute, did it
yeah.
say before they were in an apartment? So I went back and looked and I found the reference for it. But that's the only thing where I would just admit, and I don't know why that would even throw me off. I was like, are they in a hotel or are they in an apartment? Like, who
Yeah,
cares, right?
she has a bit of thought about hotels more so. But yeah, it's when she talks about the apartment situation, she says
Yeah, I
something like,
caught it later, but I had to go back and go, wait a minute, I thought they were in a hotel.
yeah, it could be because the apartment is mentioned very brief. The Americans have provided him with a place for 6 months, apparently. And then otherwise, and these nights end in hotels with mornings of regret more than anything. Well, here's another one. And her hiding all evidence of an encounter, but Timothy is here on government's work. So I slide that in there too. I don't know if you caught that.
No, I totally didn't. I was going along with you.
Yeah, no, that was like another line where I'm like, is this going to tip people off too much that she's literally hiding the evidence? But it was like, of a sexual encounter probably. And then we
No,
have,
I looked at it as she was ashamed. She
Mhm.
wanted to, she didn't want people to know she was doing this. That's what I
Yeah,
looked at it.
that's the thing, right? It's like I tricked you because
You did.
yeah. And there was also the security cameras. She unconsciously scans for security cameras. She instinctively wants no proof that this ever happened, which
Ooh.
it's a little bit, I'm being a little tricky, right? I'm dodging what she probably might actually be thinking. She'd be like, it's a little bit tricky, but
Yeah, and I was thinking she's ashamed of like the
yeah.
sexual
Mhm.
services she's providing. I looked at her as I thought she was a high class call girl,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, something like that.
Russian style, yeah.
That's cool. Well, you know what? That is good feedback. And I think maybe when I read through it or do my next edit on it or something, I could make that a little bit clearer because you don't want people to like have to stop and go back over like little minor detail stuff. If you can make it nice and clear, that's ideal.
Well, and
Definitely
it was
ideal.
still minor, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure it could just be that I didn't catch it because when I went back, I caught it. So it could have just been, the frame of mind I was
Hmm.
in when I read it. But that was the only thing that jumped out at me where I was like, wait a minute, that in the rain when I was like, okay,
Yeah,
how's
the
her hair?
rain. Yeah.
And I had to go back and but I really like that line though, not by rain. So I don't want you to get rid of
Yeah,
that.
because I did hope that created a bit of a question. I wanted it to carry people a bit, just the curiosity. Like, well, wait a minute. Like, how did she get wet? And like, why is she like? I I'm glad that it's there. Um, I know when I listened to his talk on short stories just before I wrote this actually, that Garrett sent me. Brandon Sanderson had a guest. He's a fantasy writer, I think. I haven't read any of his stuff, but I've heard great things. And he had this guest speaker in, and they filmed it and talked about short stories. And she talked about like kinds of conflict, and it was actually really helpful for me when I wrote this. She talked about basically what kind of conflict is your story, like what's the big parentheses conflict that's happening. And for me, it was like, well, I had to think about that. She doesn't want to go up to the room for the dark activity. She doesn't want that to happen. There's a part of her that doesn't want that. That's the conflict is she keeps going towards it. So then I had to think, she lays out so nicely, how do you extend the conflict? How do you like make it a worthwhile? And it's like, if this is the big conflict, then you throw obstacles in that way. If she's concerned about getting there, then maybe he's hesitant. Like you're creating opportunity for things to happen. So that's how I created the conflict, that he was going to be a little bit more, what's the word? Careful. He was going to be try to get her consent and stuff. So like she has opportunity to say no, because that's then the conflict she keeps going, even though she has the opportunity. I don't know if that's useful at all.
See, to me, the conflict in your story is class. It's the class system, right?
Hmm.
Like to me, that's how I see the conflict in your story is, traditionally, I mean, maybe it's changing a bit now, but traditionally, Russia was a very poor, struggling country, has been for a long time, right? Ever since communism, that system came up and then broke down. So there's a lot of people there that are really hurting. And I took her as being one of those women who's now, okay, like I can turn my situation around. I can feed my family. I can make a buck by servicing these men. He's the one that's always had all the advantages. If he's an American businessman traveling for business to Russia and getting put up by
the
a
government,
company, an apartment, he's making some serious bucks. So I saw it as a class conflict.
That's it. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, I don't disagree. That conflict is 100% there. Interesting that like I didn't choose to like emphasize it in my own brain. That what I focused on was I guess, yeah, just the fact of her not wanting to go up, and that what it could have been. Yeah, I wonder how much of that, like that, whatever accuracy this has in the realm of like Russian society is definitely just through the absorption of media materials and my experience in life. I studied Russian a little bit. I knew a few things about it, but
I could ask my students.
yeah, maybe get.
How accurate is this?
Yeah, if you ever.
Nothing's ever done this, but.
Yeah, especially if you have any Russians in your class.
Yeah, I do.
Please do. Yeah, see what they think. I'd love to hear that. I thought too about doing my research and writing it in Russian, like the dialogue, and making sure and then like dubbing it, but I didn't ultimately wind up going through the work. I can say very little in Russian. I can say Выглядите. I can't even say it. It's something like "you look wonderful," but I don't know how to say it anymore.
Well, and that comes with its own risks too. Like I was using Google to put some of my book that I just finished. I put some of those phrases in Balinese, and then when my Balinese sensitivity reader read it, none of it was right. Like it was all because they use shorthand just like we do, right? So when they speak, they don't say the full phrase out. They use like a shortened version all the time. No one would ever say it that way. Just like in English, no one ever talks with like no shortened sentences or no apostrophes and that, right? So it's the same thing. Like we don't say, you are going to the mall, right?
Yeah.
We don't talk like that. So I guess it was the same thing, and everything was wrong. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't.
Good thing you got that reader
rely
then.
on Google. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think I'm going to shift the conversation now. So unless you feel there's any more juice we should squeeze out of my story or the process or anything.
I just have one question on my own curiosity.
Yes.
Did everyone else in the underground writers group, did they all have stories where women stabbed people with knives, or is it just us?
Okay, so actually, one of the stories is by Chelsea Kwasny, and cool little side note about her. Last time I did this Storytime podcast with Garrett, she's a friend of mine, and she called me up and was like, hey, I was so inspired. I was listening to your podcast. I got up to the prompt and I shut it off, and I just decided to write my own thing. And I started it, and then I listened to the rest of your podcast. And I just want to know, like, could you give me a deadline? Like, how many days did you guys have? Give me the same deadline. And then she finished this really great story. So then this time came around, and I invited her to write a story, and she was totally down. And it was a fantasy story. And I can't recall all of the details of the action, but I thought there was like a sword involved, where she was stabbing, like not stabbing, but she was in an encounter with these kind of magical entities, like being taught a lesson from her master. And so there may have legit, sorry, Chelsea, if I'm saying I have to read it a second time, but yeah, it was very action oriented. So there was that. And then Garrett's was all sorts of different. It took rage and freedom, and like, oh man, Garrett did a really good job too. He had a very different modern day one that I'd like to get into, but I know it's going to get published, so I don't want to spoil it either. But Garrett did a very good job. Yeah. So if you're listening to this, by the way, and you want to get in on some of that writing action, if you want a prompt and you want a deadline, you want to do a short story, there is a low-key writers group that's happening behind the scenes. There's no barrier to entry. You don't need to be a professional or nothing. Just if you want to write a short story, hit me up, and I'll get you involved in the next one. Next guest is she doesn't know it yet, but it's probably going to be Crystal. Probably going to be Crystal. I'll just say that. Then she'll have no choice.
The next guest is Crystal Bork with a picture of
Yes.
her instead of Tara. She's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, she'll be the next writing guest if I have my way. But there's still lots of writers I'd love to get. Jared is another one. But anyway, okay, I'm segueing officially. We have about no more than 20 minutes, I'd say. But there's something, since I got you here, I want to talk to you a bit about. You've been a writer for a long time. You have, what I really admire about you is that you've put in the work and you haven't equivocated about it. From when I met you to how much I've seen you write from the 2 or 3 years that I've known you is incredible. You're incredibly prolific. But do you ever feel like, I don't know, a failure? Like, I ask that not because you are one, obviously. You've got so much success going on, but like, do you ever feel like you've never done enough? Like, what's driving you? Do you have a sense of like, you've accomplished so much. Do you feel like you can just hang it up? Or it's like, you just keep going? What keeps you staying, I guess, in that state of winning? This could be a very poorly worded question, but I know you'll take it and run with it.
Yeah, I always feel like a failure because I'm not living up to my own goals, right? Like growing up, I come from a very small, isolated community. So I was the writer in that town. And JH is going to be the writer. JH is going to, she's going to put our town on the map. She's going to be the next Stephen King. I had my writing teacher calling me Stephanie Queen,
Oh,
the
really?
whole bit. And I
Wow.
totally believed it. So in some ways, I was set up to, if I don't reach that pinnacle where I'm, developing libraries and communities and like with my name on them and, having like 8 of my books on the bestsellers list at the same time and having the movies of my books make Hollywood records at the same time, like Stephen King does, I'm a failure. There's that, like being raised believing that, oh, well, I'm destined for that success. So where the heck is it? So that's part of it. The other reason why I felt like a failure for years, and this really took me time to come to terms with this, is starting out, I knew I wanted to be a writer, always. I knew I wanted to be a novelist. That was easy. But I knew that it wasn't easy to make a living this way, at least not at first. So I decided I wanted to have some kind of writing job where I could pay my bills while still writing and then try to write the big novel on the side. So I became a journalist. And did that ever set me back as a writer? Like for years and years, because I became a very busy journalist. And when you're writing hundreds of stories all the time, articles for papers and magazines, the last thing you want to do after all that's done is write stories. I really beat myself up about that. It's like as I mentioned in the last podcast, when I finally got that novel published for the first time, and all my colleagues were saying, what else you got? Why don't you have anything else published? Why is this your first? I felt terrible.
Really?
It was an echo of that shame, that I'd always felt, because it's like, why don't I have more published? This has been all I've ever wanted to do. And what have I done? I squandered my time being a journalist.
Oh, that's so terrible that it would rob you of like the celebration of.
I squandered my time in public relations. I squandered my time in marketing. And what I've started to try and do to embrace what I've done is I've learned all the things that being a journalist taught me about writing, to write to a deadline, to treat it as a business, to quote people accurately, like to have dialogue that actually sounds like people talk.
Yeah.
And just even how people react in certain situations. I've read books or edited books where, say, a child goes missing, right? Child goes missing. The parents go to the police department to put in a report. They come back to their house. There's a scrum of reporters outside their building going, did you kill your kid? You know, I
Yeah.
would never write a scene like that because I know A, it's way too fast. And
Yeah.
B, no reporter would ever ask that. No reporters would ever do that. They're not going
Yeah.
to scrum the house of someone whose kid has just gone missing. So journalism has helped me in that way too.
Mm.
I've seen how families who have lost their children, I've seen how they grieve. I've seen how they actually react. And it's not
Yeah.
like I'm there going,
Yeah.
you know,
Notes, taking notes about
but I
it.
remember, right? I'm living their pain with them in the moment, and I'm trying to do justice to their story. But once later on, years later, I can remember that and go, yeah, this is how it is, instead of like trying to dream up in my head what that experience is like.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I've tried to turn it into a positive instead of just beating myself up for all the lost years.
Well, I'm glad. But I'm glad that you also, yeah, you're willing to say that you have felt like a failure, though, because so many people have this idea that accomplishment is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? Where if you've written, you've written like 15 books, you said, 15 novels, and like 11 of them have been published. That's insanely more than a lot of people even dream. A lot of people are like, I just want to have like write a good book someday. But the truth is, like, it's 100% true that you can have done something that's from the eyes of someone else amazing, and based on your circumstance and what people have said around you and what you came from and the reasons you got there, you can have this really unfortunate dialogue with yourself. And it's sad that you've gone through that, but I'm glad that you also spun a positive there too, realizing that the experiences that you've been through as a journalist, though it kind of set you back in terms of getting on with it, there was an amazing amount of life experience that you gained, and even some very practical productivity experience, such as writing to a deadline, getting your shit done. Like, that's really important and so hard for writers of all ages and class. So, like amateur to professional to get. We forget that you got to get your work done. So it seems like a lesson that has been gained through some trial. Do you feel like are there other writers? Because I know like a gazillion writers because you've spoken at conferences, you teach, there's so many things you've done, and I know you're well connected. You strike me as extroverted. I know you have a lot of friends. Are other writers like this too? Can they be?
I think so. I mean, I think everybody knows that great story of Stephen King writing Carrie and throwing it in the trash and his wife picking it out and sending it to the agent,
I didn't
right?
know
Like,
that.
yeah.
Oh, man.
I've heard James Joyce thought everything he wrote was crap. I think it was James Joyce. Like, it's just, there's something about being this kind of creative where we're incredibly hard on ourselves. And I know you and I have talked about this a bit, and it was probably where you were going when you asked me that question. But I mean, I live in a country where being someone who writes popular fiction is not embraced at all. I consider myself the ugly stepchild of the Canadian. I'm not even part of the Canadian literary scene.
Yeah.
Probably 98% of my readers are American or British. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, my American friends. Because it's in Canada, it's still, and this doesn't mean Canadians don't like popular fiction, but the fiction that's lauded as in this country is poetry, it's literary fiction, it's our own story, like our own personal memoirs about the families we grew up in and looking back over our lives. And I agree that's very important. But it's almost impossible when you're a popular fiction writer or a genre writer in Canada to find your tribe. We're not talked about. We're not, no one's coming up with grants or guilds or mentorship programs for people like me or people who want to be where I am now or people that could show me what I should do next. Like, we don't have that network here, which is, so it's easy. Like, say there's somebody like me, theoretically, hypothetically, say there's someone like me, and I decide I'm going to go for an award, a book award in Canada. Do you think I have a shot in hell
So
of ever winning that, no matter what I do?
I would say, as someone who, if I was ignorant of the Canadian literary scene, I would say obviously yes, of course you would. I mean, you've been a successful writer in many ways. You've put out books. People have read your work. Like, you are a name in dark fiction. That's an incredible thing. Of course they would consider you for an award. But also me, like, and my knowledge of the industry is meeker than yours for sure. What little I have, I can say quite confidently, I don't think you'd get an award in that area, which is sad to say, or not considered for award. You know what I mean? Like, it's
No.
the genre thing is really weird. People kind of throw genre fiction as it's like, yeah, it's like it's a cast off thing or something. But you know what? Look at my bookshelf. Like, this is what people read. People love genre fiction. People love dark stories and horror stories and science fiction and fantasy. It's like, that's what everybody reads. And the literary stuff is good and worthy, but it's not popular. Not as popular, I'd say. The odd one breaks out and has its moment, but it sort of seems like there's a kind of unspoken force that, you know, in terms of like getting a residency and stuff like that as well. A lot of authors who get residencies are writing stuff that, though I'd love them as people, I'd probably never read because it's not popular fiction, you know? Is that fair? Is that an assessment?
Yeah, for sure. Or, you know, the one thing that people don't realize is that there's literary genres. Like, there's literary horror, there's literary mystery, there's literary, but there's this perception, like exactly what you said about that's what people read. That's considered to be less worthy in this country. So, and when I say that, I don't mean by the average person that loves to read.
Yeah.
I mean by the powers that be, the ones that make these decisions. If you're popular, if people want to read your stuff, you're crap.
And it's terrible.
And I don't necessarily think it's just in Canada, because Stephen King had this great quote where he said, roughly paraphrased, you know, you're either going to be a commercial success or a critical one, and never the twain shall meet. You know, no matter what you write, someone's going to try and make you feel bad about that. And I don't take anything away from people who write poetry in Canada or people who write literary books. That's great. I just wish, I mean, I talked to a fellow, not to name names, I talked to a fellow whose book was a New York Times bestseller, translated in 30 languages, got over $1 million for the book advance, got millions of dollars for foreign rights deals, got over $1 million for the movie option, and he also didn't win that award for Book of the Year. So that's when you kind of, and it's not just on sales, of course not, but if that many people read your book and liked your book from all over the world, and the publisher saw fit to publish it in 30 different languages,
Yeah.
maybe it should get mentioned in the province we live in.
Right.
Maybe just a little like, good for you when
Yeah.
he came from here, right? But that'll never happen. So you either accept that and make your peace with it and focus on the people who do love your writing, or it will make you feel horrible. It'll make you feel like there's no worth to what I'm putting out. It's not good enough. It's not good enough for the people at the Blank Writers Guild. It's not good enough for me. So you have to figure out a way to work with that somehow.
Well, and I think you found your tribe, like you said, like in American and British markets primarily. Not to say you don't have Canadian readers. I know several of them, but the fact is, though it is a wide world, and it is at least nice that you can kind of branch out. But it's sad too that you're not lauded as like, here's a great dark fiction writer who we have like sitting in Canada right now. You're not highlighted on CBC, not to put them on blast, but you know what I mean? Like, they're not interested in your work, which is sad to me because it's good work. And it's funny. It's, you know what strikes me as It's like it strikes me as a Karen a little bit with the upward nose, saying,
Yeah.
"Oh, you know, this kind of fiction is just not proper. It's just not good for us." And
I
and
don't read fill in the blank.
yeah, exactly. Like, and that's I feel like the universities and stuff like that play a bit of a role in terms of education around literary, work. I took some university for English and creative writing as well, and we studied primarily literary, or we studied something that was science fiction and they called it literary with
Exactly.
like the good old, it was a Oryx and Crake, which was Margaret Atwood. That is a sci-fi. It's a dystopian sci-fi. Hands down. It is a piece of genre fiction. But in the class that I studied it was literary,
Because Margaret Atwood has written literary fiction, so now it's okay.
Right.
See, she broke the mold. So she can have The Handmaid's Tale become a huge TV series, and we'll still admit she's Canadian because she's written literary fiction.
Yeah.
We can still say, oh, she's one of ours, she's our daughter,
Uh-huh.
because she's also written literary fiction. So she's able to blur the lines. But yeah, I mean, look at a lot of books that I read that were touted as literary. The Chrysalids,
Oh, really?
totally sci-fi.
Yeah.
Lord of the Flies. Is that not genre fiction? Seems like a thriller to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
All that stuff about symbolism, he didn't write that. The author wasn't thinking that. He wasn't writing it going, let's have Piggy's glasses break now so it can symbolize the end of the intellectual age.
Yeah.
No way. No way. If so, someone told him that later. Hey, did you mean this when Piggy's glasses broke? And he went, that sounds great.
I got it right here, actually.
That's a great
William
book.
Golding, Lord of the Flies.
It's a great book.
Confession, I haven't read it. It's on my shelf and I haven't read it. I know. I'm admitting this to you. I might regret that, but there's a few books.
Stunt bookshelf. It's a stunt bookshelf.
No, I've legit read probably about 90% of this bookshelf, but there are a few books I just haven't gotten around to. This is one of them. But now
Is War and Peace on there?
War and Peace is not on there.
Okay.
Negative.
Because if War and Peace is on there, it's a stunt bookshelf.
Yeah, because no one reads that anymore. No, I think you make it's just a terribly great point to make, especially when you think of young authors who are impressionable and, well, I honestly, I consider myself impressionable, I still have dreams of publishing, and I've got a couple short stories published, and now I have my podcast with which to put them out into the world. But I have written a novel. I'm on the second draft. I want to get published. It's science fiction. It's not hard sci-fi very much in way, but it's science fiction as it gets. And a lot of it's compatriot types of books. If I were to ever get it published, a lot of them would be in literary. And it's this kind of science fiction is like the dirty stepchild. Like you said, it's we can't have that. In fact, I listened to Orson Scott Card. He's written some books I really love, Ender's Game and whatnot. And I listened to a talk by him, and he talked a little bit about the state's situation in terms of genre fiction. And he said how many science fiction writers are now fantasy writers down there. And the only real determinate difference he could find between science fiction and fantasy was that science fiction had rivets on the cover and fantasy had trees. And that otherwise, they were pretty darn similar. They were both speculative fiction, right? So and it's not just a Canadian thing, but of what is Canadian. It's kind of too bad that it's that way. Do you think it'll ever change? Do you think it's to what level is it worth fretting about? And must be good to know as a young author, what would you say to someone who's trying to get into there or who's trying to find their voice,
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because one thing this fellow put to me, Mr. New York Times bestseller, was he said, and I'd already been thinking of it this way, but he cemented what I was already thinking about, if that's even a word. He said, instead of complaining that there's no tribe, that there's no group here, make one. So now that's a bit of a challenge with timing, of course, and energy and effort, but it's something I really, really am starting to think about. And I think that will be the only thing that ever really changes it is right now, the money, I use this term loosely, but the money in Canadian literature is through grants. It's through
Right.
art funding. It's through university residency programs, because the idea is we want to preserve our Canadian voice. And for so long, our Canadian voice has meant literary works or poetry, right? Not genre, not classic. Like we could have a riveting mystery about, what's going on in one of our cities in urban Canada, and it still wouldn't quite be preserving our story. So in order to combat that, in order to kind of change that, the genre writers of Canada have to create our own. And I would love for that someday. If I could be successful enough that I could offer someone a grant, a genre writer, a new genre writer, if I could give them a grant to support their work, that's as high as a grant coming from the Canadian Arts Council or the Manitoba Arts Council or whatever arts council you want to pick, I would love to do that. But I think it's going to be that. I think it's going to be everybody who does write popular fiction, instead of us going like, oh, like, don't look at me, all the stuff, instead of us doing that, us coming together and saying, yeah, let's meet, let's talk about this, let's have our own guild. Oh, you wanted a mentor, but you couldn't get accepted into this mentor program because you don't write poetry? Well, you know what? I'll mentor you, or so-and-so will mentor you. Or maybe you've heard of Susie Maloney. She got $1 million book deal and $1 million movie review or movie option too. Let's get her to mentor you. Like, until we start doing all of that, I don't think it'll change, but I think we have to change it. I think the genre writers of Canada have to be the ones that change it. I don't think the literary establishment is going to wake up one day and go, we need one of those riffraff out there. One of those, what does she write? Mystery, thriller, who knows? Put her in.
No, you need...
I'm not just saying I'm going to start my own university.
No.
I'm definitely going to try and do something.
Well, I think that there is so much more option out there in terms of getting educated as a writer. University, I learned a bit. I did get some creative writing. I dropped out after 2 years because I didn't see the point of my degree. That's a whole thing. But I would love to see that too. I would love to see maybe start a conference or something. You know what I mean? Like a writers' conference that's focused on bringing in Canadian talent, but a broader spectrum of Canadian talent. Have a couple of seats for the literaries. Throw them a bone, but also bring in like genre writers, people who write what people read. Bring those people and get aspiring authors, aspiring writers, like make an event of it or something, like create some connection. I know that it's a worthy pursuit, and I think it's almost an inevitability as long as there are writers like you who do care about it and who are connected. And, I think a cool testament to your character is that I'm a very, I would say, novice writer in terms of fiction. I've very little that's published. I've not done very much with it. But you've been so strongly encouraging to me and inspirational to me. I think that we have is a bit of a microcosm of what can be and will be created over time. So if you're a young writer or an older writer who's just trying to get into it, right? Like, I think you got to make that for yourself and be okay understanding that the industry might snub you a bit, but that doesn't mean that readers will.
No. And I think you do kind of have to make a choice a little bit, although some of us would argue this is chosen for us. But what's more important to you? Is it making a living writing, Is it hearing from people on a regular basis who are really touched by your stories? Or is it being critically acclaimed in this country? Is it getting writing grants in this country? Is it getting residencies in this country? Because they're two totally different things. Now, you can have books that are funded that way that end up being big commercial successes, but that doesn't happen very often. It's usually an either or scenario. Do you want to be loved or do you want to be famous? I'm not saying I want to be famous, but it's kind of like, do you want to be commercial or do you want to be literary? Which I would argue, there's lots of literary commercial writing. But look at, for instance, Dan Brown, right? Maybe a bad example. But Dan Brown comes out with the Da Vinci Code. It explodes. And you see people everywhere. As soon as everyone starts to like that book, a lot of people are like, oh, that's crap. That's crap. Never read that. How could anyone read that? They might have liked his earlier books, which were very scientific. I mean, you listen to Dan talk. He's a very intelligent guy. He's got like all this research he does. It's just his process is crazy. But you'll see people say he can't possibly be a writer because, God, you see, like everybody likes him. It's the same music snobs, right?
Yeah,
same idea.
There's similarities too. And I mean, similarities, like my most known form of artistry that I do would be rap music and production. So I produce and make my own rap music. And there is not a huge culture for that in Canada. Now, I will say there are some, there's a good pocket in Toronto. Calgary and Edmonton got their own little thing that's going on. Like there are places, the cities that got their little thing going on. And I think King of the Dot Entertainment is out in Toronto. So there's a little something going on there. But it is a different beast altogether, basically, to have commercially accepted music versus being alternative. And I'd be considered alternative. My stuff, you won't find it on the radio most of the time. Though it has played on the radio before, you basically won't ever find it there. And So, I really appreciate your thoughts on this and just your frank thoughts on this too. I think that that's really useful for me. It's useful for other writers and people who are aspiring to get into it. I wanted to talk to you a great deal about productivity, but you know what? I'm not going to, because I'd like to have you on some other time in the future where we can talk more about that and really, really dive into it. But this was a good meaty chunk. I don't know. I feel inspired. I just feel like I want to write more right now. I've been trying
I didn't go off on too much of a tangent, did I?
No. This was, it was
hate
worthy.
mail? Is hate mail coming from me?
Oh, not from Dan Brown.
How dare you?
We'll get a letter from Margaret Atwood. She'll be like, you brought up.
But Margaret Atwood would back me up on this, I'm pretty sure. She knows what I'm saying is true. Like, she worked both. So she kind of gets this literary pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's where we'll end it. Is there any final thoughts? I'm going to give the final thought to you. What should we end on? What should we take from this?
This part's going to be cut out, right?
Oh, of course. Anything you want.
I think that you have to embrace who you are as a writer. That's not always an easy thing. We're sort of conditioned as creative people to loathe ourselves or think at times that our work sucks or think we're never going to be where we want to be. And we might not be, right? But you have to make peace with the kind of writer you are. And I don't think we have a lot of choice over that sometimes. Like I could go out and try my best to write poems about hockey. And I think I'm a decent writer when in my good days. Like right now, I think I'm a decent writer. If something really bad happens tomorrow, I'll suck again. But right now I'm doing okay. So I could try to write some really kick-ass poems about hockey. But I'm not promising they'd be any good. The type of writer I am, even when it comes to a little short story like this, is something dark is going to happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, those hockey players are going to die.
Yeah, those hockey players are going to die. And there's usually some sort of supernatural element to it, even if it's slight. Even if it's very minuscule, there's something. That's not something I ever plan. It just always, my brain goes that way. So if I was setting my sights on being the best hockey poet of my generation, I would never, ever be satisfied with who I am, right? So that's what I mean by, it's a ludicrous example, but that's what I mean by being comfortable with the writer you are. If you really love romance, I've met so many romance writers that are ashamed that they write romance. They're like,
That's too
I
bad.
love romance. I feel bad, you know. Embrace it. Like, romance is the most popular genre, the most widely read genre in the world for a reason. People love to be taken out of their mundane, boring relationships, their mundane, boring lives, and to have this exciting romantic adventure. You give that to people when you write romance. I could never do it well because everyone would die. So I can't do that. But you can. And that's the thing. Like, be proud of the type of writer you are. Don't think you have to hide it from your friends and family. Don't think, unless I do have a friend that writes erotica and she's a preschool teacher. She
Yeah,
kind
you
of
might have to hide that.
Yeah, you know, in some cases you have to hide a little bit. But ordinarily,
so funny.
just be proud of who you are. Like, just be proud of the type of writer you are and be okay with it and work at being okay with it. Because there's, like Stephen King said, no matter what you write, there's going to be someone who's going to try and make you feel bad about it. The trick is to not let that somebody be you.
And that's a perfect note to end on. Well done, JH. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Sorry for ranting.
It's good. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you found any of this valuable, please consider subscribing, recommending this to a friend, or leaving a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. If you watch this on my Servant YouTube channel or Facebook page, please leave a comment and share. I love to hear from my listeners and learn from them. Learn more about me at www.servant.com. That's SRVENT.com. Thank you again for your time. Now go be creative and sane.